Okay, fantastic. Are you ready? Okay, good. My name is Simone Zeefuik. I'm happy to be here at Kunsthal, and I'm honored to have a conversation with Thomas J. Pryce about his fantastic, fantastic work. I'm not a long bio kind of person, especially not right in front of like a 1-hour interview where people just tackle the entire bio, basically. But he studied at the Royal Chelsea College and the Royal Academy of London, had exhibitions in the UK, Canada, the US, and now for the first time in the Netherlands. That deserves like a little bit of applause, no? Okay, good. Early things. Okay, so when the door opens, perhaps you can imagine like a smoke machine, good music coming on, and I say give a warm welcome to Thomas J. Pryce.
Thank you. Thank you.
Morning.
Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm good. Am I on? I am on.
You
Okay.
are absolutely on. Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
I figured maybe we can start, because I feel like as a creative person, what you make is a reflection of what you like and what you enjoy.
Yeah.
So can you start off by telling us something about your artistic vocabularies? What do you like? What do you see?
My
Movie,
artistic
series.
vocabulary is a lovely way of putting it. I think, like most people.
Oh, no.
You good?
I'm here.
Okay.
Yes.
My artistic vocabulary, it's quite a mixture of things. Highbrow, lowbrow, and in between. Spanning from, I was brought up in South London, and my mother would take myself and my brothers to the South Bank before it was a kind of popularized tourist destination from people from North London. So it was bare bones, brutalist architecture. And I loved that. In fact, my mother came to the opening of the show, and she said something that she's always said, which is, boredom is good for you.
Boredom is good for us in what way?
So
Somebody
yes, I'm
relates.
laughing. I think it gives you the space to be creative, because your brain has to fill in the gaps. It has to fill in you get to engage with yourself in a way that, because modern day life, we're constantly bombarded by people trying to get our attention.
Definitely.
In a way, I'm trying to get your attention when I make the works, but we have people trying to sell us things, sell us ideas, sell us products, take our time, take our data now, and engage with us constantly. And through our phones, we're constantly being, kind of prodded and poked. But when you're in a rainy South Bank next to the river with only kind of textured concrete around you, there's an imagination which is, I think, triggered or allowed to germinate and propagate and evolve in a way that you become self-reliant on your own perception of space, of the way that you flow through space, but just the sort of the sense, the quietness of your mind, almost. Right. And so that allows your ideas to have a platform with yourself, so you get to engage your own kind of musings on things.
Right.
I probably talked around the fact of what I'm actually into in terms of music, because I'm embarrassed.
A little bit,
I'm often asked what's my favorite music, and that's a difficult question, I think, for anybody to answer. It's a bit like that one. And I say opera. And people are like, what? You like opera? And so I can remember being a small child and going to a jumble sale and finding a CD, which was The Force of Destiny, and playing the CD and being absolutely swept away into another world, which I did not understand what was happening, but the music, the sounds, the melody, the pacing, the ebb and flow, the drama swept me up into something and transported me from a little house in South London to the great expanses of the mind. And I remember feeling emotion in a way that I hadn't really been able to feel or express. And I think it's because the composer carried me through this journey. And it really, again, like the architectural space, the musical scape allowed me to connect with parts of myself that were perhaps slightly suppressed by conditions that I was living in. And by the things that I had to deal with as a child. And here I was being sort of guided through this sort of I don't know, this expansive, almost romantic, kind of fictional, endless realm of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Do you still listen to it as you create your work?
I do. I mean, so when I make work, I often don't listen to music in the beginning stages. Mm-hmm. So when I'm creating the characters, or I won't necessarily listen to music because I don't want that to guide what I'm doing. I don't want it to be an illustration of somebody else's sort of emotional, sounds. Mm-hmm. But there's always music in my head, perhaps. Mm. And I do often then put music on at certain points. Right. When I do the other kind of works, I have music. I listen to Abdul Ibrahim and lots of jazz, and this idea of the playfulness of sound, the playfulness of music, the call and answer, the sort of again the rhythm. I've talked about rhythm in the show. Right. I think rhythm is such an important way to understand a work, a show, a way of thinking.
Beautiful. And can you tell us a little bit more about your process of making? So you shifted from making with your hands, like literally sculpting the clay, to being it more of a digital process.
Yeah, I mean, if you've seen the show, you'll see that my hands and touch are really important to me, and I've kind of grown to acknowledge that, and I talk a lot with my hands, and I'm going to be super self-conscious, but I talk a lot with my hands, and this idea of connection, and how we connect through the hands or through the eyes. So when I was young, I was always making things. I was always playing with things. I was always breaking things or playing with things, trying to make things and exploring the world, like I think we often do as children with my hands, and then it's kind of like drilled out of us. But I was very lucky to have a mother who was very creative and who would encourage play, who would encourage us to make and to explore. Right. And so, I would have arrangements of pebbles from the beach or wire. I'd find scrap wire and I'd make trees or figures. And I'd always be playing and I'd be showing people, like, look at this thing. And so I got into sculpting because I liked the idea of playing with space and our understanding of our presence in space through materiality. And so the idea of the tactile feedback, the idea of the sort of the physical resonance of touching a thing and understanding that thing in terms of its density or its texture or how it relates to your own presence was really satisfying to me. And so I would make stuff in clay. I'd move from wire to clay to, I used to use tin foil, aluminium foil as armatures. And I used to just stare at this sort of foil thing, and your mind projects. And that's when I got kind of into the sense that of the viewer filling in the last bits of the information, which is why the eyes of most of the characters are hollow. It's because I want the viewer to fill in the gaps. So this idea of feeling the material and forming it slowly in front of you and imagining who this person might be, because they're all fictional. So it gave me time to sort of play with different physiognomies, different arrangements of faces. And then, cutting many years down the line, I've always been interested in technology. So then, digital clay, as I call it, digital sculpting methods sort of really progressed. I can remember, I think it was 2005 when I was in the Royal College of Art, and we had this haptic feedback stylus, this pen, that you could you plug into a computer, and it projects this on the screen. There's this digital clay, and the stylus would kind of give you this haptic feedback. It was like push against you to try and simulate the idea of playing with this real material, and it was terrible. But it was the most high-tech thing that was in existence at that time. And then a few years later, I was told that it ended up in the skip, literally in the skip, outside in a bin. That's how bad it was. So what I use today is actually, there's another program where it doesn't try and work with a stylus, but the way that they've managed to make the material react on screen, your brain fills in the gaps. Right. So I feel like I'm pushing and playing with clay. I feel like I'm carving away in the material. And it allows the expression of a physical material in a virtual world. And that sort of expands the possibilities of what you can do.
Because you said something so interesting during the press tour of your show. You talked about claying being an analog process?
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a bit more
for
those of us?
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you for bringing it back to that point. I say that, clay for me is a linear or an analog linear process. So you have an object, it's in front of you, you make a change to that object, and then you follow that path of changes in a singular line towards what then becomes your end result. Whereas with digital, you can have a virtual object, you can take another copy of that object, you can make a change to both things, or keep your original as a reference, you can make another copy, and you have multiple lines of which, multiple journeys these things can go on. And so what it did was it allowed me to do these comparative exercises, because I've always been talking about, in terms of the figurative work, I always talked about it as the nuances. You know, the slight shift of an eyebrow, or the slight shift of where somebody is looking, or where the mouth goes, or the tilt of a head. It communicates something vastly different. And again, when we're given the space and the quietness to really absorb that, it kind of, I don't know, it makes us, I hope it makes us more aware of how we process things and how we process each other.
I'm glad that I did something probably wrong with the slides, but you can see some of the examples of your work behind you.
Yeah, I got the screen now. Yeah.
And can you talk about a little bit about the sculpture on, for you, the right, mixed feelings about bus drives and the process of, because that was your...
That was the first physical sculpture I showed in public. And for me, this was the culmination of a lot of realizations. So I was recognizing the power of, or that exists already in terms of representation of value, of status of individuals in society. You know, I'd studied classics at school. I was very, sort of versed in the Roman portrait and the portrait of a leader and the way that it's formally supposed to exist, the material it's supposed to be in. You know, the Romans took their references from the Greeks, who did works in bronze. The Romans did a lot in marble. And so here we have a plaster head with marble dust in it. So again, it's this kind of critiquing of the material itself that a work in a certain format is supposed to exist in. The idea of a real individual. So, we as nations and societies tell ourselves these stories or give these narratives to certain individuals and say, this is why they are revered, this is why they are great, this is why they are atop a plinth or better than you, or why they should be looked up to and we should aim to be as good as them, or why you should accept their rule over you. But what happens if you make that a fictional person? So what happens if it's not about a narrative that we have to accept and continue? So I talk about using these kind of psychological portraits or these fictional people to communicate real feelings, real connections, as opposed to fictional narratives to kind of, continue a power structure. So again, with the materiality of this work, the wood that you see is like cheap MDF, cheap compressed fiberboard that I took out of the bin when I was at the Royal College. And you can see, upstairs you can see it's on the wall with one screw. So in terms of even the idea of presentation, I'm trying to deal with this idea of how we present things in order to communicate the value that's supposed to be connected to them. So this little piece is a very small work, and the other important ingredient to this work is the wall it is on. So I tend to try and put it on the biggest wall that I can. And I had to fight and lie when I was at the Royal College to say I was going to build a room.
You lied and said?
I lie all the time. I had to secure this space in a very competitive environment in order to get this wall that I wanted. I managed to place it between two columns, which luckily, we've been able to sort of do upstairs, which is brilliant. So this idea of the grandeur, the understood grandeur of the architecture that adds itself to the impact of the work. And it's about really trying to make the viewer conscious of all these ingredients and all these elements that we take for granted now. And we understand sort of in our back of the mind's subconscious level, as these are very orchestrated things that are used to control our perception of ourselves and the ruling powers around us.
And all your works are of like fictionalized characters. When did you decide to make fictionalized work instead of saying, I'm going to make a portrait?
I think as soon as I started to look into figuration, which was not my initial interest. I came from a background of looking at the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind and looking at subliminals and how we are nudged in certain directions or how we are controlled and how advertising has a psychological grasp on us to control our thoughts and our beliefs, which we then think are our beliefs. When somebody suggests something to you enough times, you take that on, and then suddenly you're telling people about that, and it's your thought and it's your belief, and then you're defending it. And I just find it really incredible that we are aware of this. but it's so effective on us. And so I was trying to create characters from subliminal messages in video works and sound works. And then the idea of figuration was a way to connect to a viewer in a very direct way, where the person felt able to engage and comment upon. So to create something which a person would then be able to challenge. And the idea of the fictional character was because I wanted to challenge the notion of the portrait, and the understanding of value connected to the portrait. And so the portrait was commissioned by wealthy people, wealthy individuals, who wanted to show how successful they were, or at some level wanted to celebrate themselves, or join the canon of celebrated individuals who hang on the walls of museums, or even in our other fictionalized the kind of films and references, there's a portrait of somebody above a fireplace, or and they go, "That's my great-great-grandfather who took over India," or something, and and they go, "Well done, it's paid for this house that you live in today." And I wanted to tap into that desire and tap into that pride and the illustriousness of it all, and just scrape past that surface and go, what happens if we do it about being human? What happens if we make a work which celebrates what it means to have empathy, to connect? Or what happens if we create a work where people feel they cannot connect to? Will that make people aware of the kind of the dynamics of interactions between ourselves? So I was making works initially about being human, so I didn't want to make it about an individual fictional narrative, self-perpetuating sort of story of how somebody became so great. I wanted to challenge the idea of what a portrait can be, and make it about being human. And then from an external point, it was racialized.
Not by you, of course.
Not by me. I was making people.
I love the smirk as you say that.
Smirk,
The smirk. But as you talk about like these grand figures and how do you... Oh, somebody's coming up. Hello. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the sculpture we see on the left, Man on a Horse, King's Avenue, and your way of paying homage to everydayness. As much in the skills, but also in the titles, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I love a title because it's another way to guide people through the terrain of the possibilities of what you're presenting. And I think there's poetry in a lot of people's titles. I think a lot of the works that I really respond to in other artists have titles which are open.
Thank you.
And they add to the possibilities as opposed to take you straight to what you're supposed to think. And so I think it's in keeping with my approach to the work, which is that we bring ourselves to the work. Is that we bring our understandings, we bring our identities, we bring our schemas, our attitudes, the learned lessons that we've had from society or from our families or from our experiences. And so something like King's Avenue, this piece is a fictional character again, based on sort of a play on Marini, sort of sculptures of men on horses. So it's an acknowledgement of the canon of sculpture and the canon of accepted highbrow sculpture in sort of modernist sculpture. But also this idea of the monument and this idea that this man is on a horse. Well, it was based on somebody I saw in a betting shop looking up at a monitor of a horse race. But I love the idea that this guy was so put together and was like really confident and was, he felt like the king of that place. And so he has the details, the attributes, which sort of allow us to understand that he is aware of himself and how he's presented to the world. And it's just putting these two things in conversation. So our expectation of what a man on a horse as a monument should be, and then what was presented to us as this sort of a construct of attitudes and experiences in a fictional character.
Speaking of things being in conversation with each other, we had a beautiful show at the V&A. And we see it here. Signals being in conversation with, what is it, like Samson the Philistines?
Samson the Philistines, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about how you position the work in this already like grand exposition?
I mean, somewhere like the V&A is an incredibly rich place to play with.
It's like the Rijksmuseum, something like this.
Yeah, it's where the historical greats are, and I got to move a Rodin sculpture to put one of mine in, and that was like a nice moment to record. But for me, there's so many levels. So formally speaking, obviously we have the triangular composition. So when I got into looking at figurative work, I got into it from a bit of a geeky sculptural perspective of loving composition, and is it the Baroque or is it like triangular, or what kind of forms are we making here? And that's understood on a very immediate level by an audience. But this for me was an interesting one because this is called Signals, and it's actually, I made the original maquette many years ago before camera phones. And so this guy was actually trying to get signal on his phone, which is like a take on trying to connect, and this idea of connection and not being connected. And when I did one of my first small sculptures which was a public commission, it was actually rejected because the original commissioning body became concerned that the national press were going to say that it was a criminal because it was a young black man holding a phone. Which at the time was a young black man with a phone, and I thought this is typical. But this is, so the idea of this work of a young man holding a phone trying to connect to the world, connect to maybe to a loved one, or connect to an important call, or connect just to something positive, potentially. Placed next to an incredibly violent sculpture, which people visit and take their children to and go, look at that beautiful sculpture. And we worship the provenance of that sculpture. We worship the formal elements of that sculpture. We worship the material of that sculpture. And we gloss over the violence because the violence doesn't exist in that moment. It's beauty. And yet that figure, or a figure like that, is subject to perceptions of fear, violence, and threat. And so for me, it's very interesting to place these works together in that environment, in this context of the V&A, one of the top museums in the UK, where beauty is celebrated, and see what happens. Like, is Signals able to be imbued with the same qualities as Samson the Philistines? But just to kind of, for me, it's just to draw attention to, or to play with this understanding of perception and perception within society, and who is subject to different rules.
Let me go to the next one. If I can make it work, here we go. I cannot make it work. The marble rhapsody. That's also part of the exhibition. So, well, again, this was the paper version of going into the V&A, really. So this is when I was a fellow at the British School at Rome, and I got access to their library. Their library is incredible. It has all these incredibly rare books, and there were doctors of divinity and sort of PhD students using the library. And I'm very dyslexic, so I approached the world in a different way, and I approached books in a different way. So I went for the picture books, but the books that showed these sculptural references, again, of ideas of permanent understanding. The idea that experts have said, this is what this is who this is, and this is what we should think about them based on the characters' descriptions, right? And it's in the book, so it's official, and it's in the library, and it's official. And I wanted to explore this idea of agency and this idea of narrative, provenance, and creating my own versions. What happens if I decided this is actually, so I'd take the pages and I'd bend them over and I'd create different relationships between different images to suggest different narratives. I would kind of complete forms that would actually go beyond the page. So to make the book an object in this image. The titles, again, are like suggestive sort of things. And it was about, and my hands become, the most vivid characters within these arrangements. So this book was about, obviously, these works were about using the things that we normally take to be authority and showing how plastic they are. Showing how, an archaeologist has pulled out the ground many different fragments of a thing and put them together and gone, this is Apollo, or and there's a tiny little head on Apollo, but this is Apollo, and they put a lot of filler in, and then they put it in the museum. So this is really about the idea of provenance, being official, but also how we construct character and how we can construct perceptions and identities for one another, and of ourselves as well, importantly. So it kind of connects to all of the things that I'm talking about in the sculptures and the other works. And maybe it also underlines that what we accept as these authoritative works are also fiction.
Exactly
like
that.
you said, like we take scraps and we say, oh, this is this statue.
It's about acceptance, and if you're in a certain position, you are able to be the one that controls what the story is.
Right.
You know, I think you're able to give yourself or give other people identities, to give them qualities, attributes, so which then sets up an expectation of behavior, which sets up an expectation of how one should respond to them, or what one can expect from them, and how you should treat them. And that has a governing principle over the lives of everybody. And I find it interesting, shall we say, who gets to do that, who is subjected to that, and what are the results of that.
Right. And what was the result of Witness the Distance Within, a gorgeous work?
Yeah, The Distance Within. This was an amazing piece because in terms of, I was commissioned by the Studio Museum in Haarlem, which I'd visited for many, many years, and Thelma Golden's art world's star and incredible individual who's done so much for so many different artists and so many communities. And this is in Marcus Garvey Park. Obviously, you know, the history of Marcus Garvey is incredible. So this was a work that I made for them and then was installed into Marcus Garvey Park during the lockdown, I believe. So I couldn't go there. But I stay in Harlem when I go to New York, so I knew the place very well. I'd chosen the location. And then the community owned that work. They brought the identity of that work. When I later came back to visit, you know, I walked up close to the sculpture. They're like, excuse me, you know, I was like,
really?
Yeah, they're protective of that work. They embraced the work. The work became somebody that they knew. It became a character that represented them. And there was a wonderful video that a friend who I stay with in Harlem sent me when it was just about to be deinstalled, of a guy who was telling her about how people felt about that work, and and who's walking his dog, and how people, had kind of brought that work into their lives. And you know, me as the artist, I make the thing, and I'm talking about the rhythm of the drapery and the way it stands, but I don't get to humanize it in that way because I don't have the everyday experience with the work. So when I come back to a place, like I've come back to Rotterdam and seen moments contained outside the train station, it's incredible to see what people do and how amazing people can be with these pieces and create their own sense of agency with them and expand the narrative of who this human being is.
Right. So you said you were commissioned by the Studio Museum in Haarlem to make it. How do you know, or how do you feel, what kind of work fits a specific kind of location? So Central Station you didn't choose, that was Drom and Dad, but this one you said you chose the location.
I push for the Central Station.
It's proper. As you should.
In honesty, there's only so much you can do. Like, I try and concentrate on the work itself. So what happens if I put it in somewhere totally different? Right. Like, I wouldn't want to make a work that I try to say, as somebody who's not from Haarlem, this is Haarlem, right? I'm not going to do it justice because I don't know the details in a way that I could say about Brixton and South London.
Right.
But I don't think it needs that. And I think it's about having a work which is rich in content, detail, and possibility, and is a kind of an engaging invite for the viewer to connect. Because then people have a discussion. Who is that? That's normally the first question. Who is that? Now, if you're asking a question about somebody that you might ordinarily look away from or walk past or hear a terrible story about because that's what the media likes to do, we've already shifted the way that we're engaging with people. We've already shifted the way that we're talking amongst ourselves about people. It's giving us an opportunity to reflect on ourselves because, oh, I thought that was... And then you have to delve into why you thought that was a way. So the presumptions that you bring to the work are challenged immediately through the process of conversation. So it doesn't have to be a didactic, me shouting or pointing at viewers going, it's a conversation, it's an open conversation which the viewers, the public, the individuals create themselves. So it's a self-educating, it's a self-exploring process which is bespoke to that set of people, which I couldn't control.
Right.
I could not do it as well as people do it themselves. And so for me, this idea of location, the show is called Matter of Place, the idea of location is such a powerful element to the understanding of the works because it gives the same thing a totally different meaning if it's over there. But then we can see where the humanity connects them.
And tell us again why you push for Central Station, which I love. But why did you feel like it has to be
Because she should be in a very prominent place where she could be celebrated or discussed, and the idea of movement of people and the idea of who belongs or who is Rotterdam, who is a place, I think is incredibly important. We need to challenge the expectations and the limitations that we set for one another. And for me, she has become Rotterdam, but that's for me. People might think differently. But for other people who look like that to have an opportunity to see themselves centered, taking up space, is incredibly powerful. And I didn't realize how powerful it was until I saw people seeing the work who hadn't seen themselves. I'm not talking specifically about this piece. I mean, I've had technicians in art fairs take pictures with the works many years ago when they didn't know I was the artist. I was installing my own work. And they would take pictures because I didn't even realize I was making this work because I hadn't seen myself. You know? So the idea of being centered in space in a way that is open to interpretation but is ultimately an opportunity to celebrate and to represent the majority, to represent a place, when otherwise, you know, particularly with black people, you'd be in the back of a painting holding a cup, or you'd be an ethnographic example of a brave warrior or the heroic Negro, okay? These are the representations that you have to reference if you come from that background as that's you, and you get people showing you these images going, oh, look, I found a piece that's just like yours. And it's a limited representation that it reinforces an existing power structure that many people have become comfortable with because they've orientated themselves within it, and they've established themselves in it. They've established power or authority or money or position within it. And so when people come along and go, and just try and just push the boundary a little bit and go, what about this? You know, they see it as extra labor. They see it as a threat. And I'm saying, no, it's just about acknowledging the expansive nature of what it means to be human. And just because somebody else says, I am human too, does not mean you are no longer human. You know? So for me, these works are about everybody being able to expand their understanding of what it means to exist with one another.
Gorgeous, and it reminded me of the first time I saw Reaching Out. Is it called The Line in London?
Yeah.
And same as here, you see people working on the statue, and you see this black girl on her phone chilling as all these construction workers are trying to like fit her into the ground. And what Shera also pointed out during the, Shera called the curator. Maybe a little bit of applause for Shera. Also point out it does something, seeing them in a specific kind of space, minding their own business.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about why you made them so self-contained and not engaging with people around them?
I mean, their self-containment is absolutely a acknowledgement of the power dynamic that is supposed to exist. You know, the performative way that particularly black people have to exist in the world to communicate, I'm safe. Or, you know, or it's okay what you just said. It's fine what you just said. So the smile. You know, my sculptures don't smile because when we're by ourselves, we tend not to smile. It's kind of moronic. You know, you might have a little smirk, or you might, you know, but it's a brief thing. And once you put something into a sculpture, you know, it has a sense of permanence. And so smiles are often used as a contrast to what normally exists within sculpture, right? So this idea of somebody being self-contained, confident, in their own world, we all experience that. We all want that. Okay, nobody wants to have to smile at somebody the whole time. You know, if you walk down the street, maybe lots of women know this. If you get told to smile
all the time,
that kind of, we have a term for it now. We call it microaggression. I'd call it just aggression. But we have these where people want to implement their expectations, their standards on somebody else because they feel entitled to do so. Right. So with these figures, it's about the power in just being yourself, power in being able to slouch, stand up straight, take your hands out your pockets, otherwise the police might stop you. Take your hands out your pockets, otherwise you're being disrespectful. You know, don't wear that hoodie because, well, what do you expect people to think about you? You know? So this idea of sculptures in the material of power in bronze or with marble, being themselves in a public place or just in public view, I think has an undertone to it, which is a powerful thing, because we all know that's not what the reality is. We kind of meet these works, and they subtly change our understanding of an established format. And I hope they do it with humanity, which makes us carry away with us, a deeper understanding of what we used to think, and then leaves us with the questions of like how we want to move forward.
What I think what's interesting about your work is that the large sculptures have the same effect as the smaller sculptures. They both demand your attention in a specific kind of way. And you often talk about scale, using scale as a material on its own. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, scale is an incredibly powerful element in terms of psychology and experience of the world. And it touches on, I guess, the interest with architecture. I have my older brother's an architect, and I always laugh about, he's a control freak, because they control the way we flow. They control the way we use spaces, and the spaces that we spend our time in has an impact on our emotions, and our emotions impact the way we interact with one another and the things that we take on or the decisions that we make. Yeah. I like the idea. So when I did the mixed feelings about bus drivers, the small sculpture on the wall, I like the interaction between our expectations of scale as it relates to human representation in that format of the monument or the illustrious portrait of the leader, and how that small object of a fictional person in a non-precious material commanded the whole wall. And the way that it's placed down on the wall, so it's lower than one would ordinarily interact with a piece. It controls the way we move. So you tend to be drawn in because it's small, so you want to see what it is. And then you have to lower yourself down to it, so you physically have to inhabit a space that you wouldn't ordinarily get to when looking at a work. And then you sort of zoom out again because you realize, is that the only thing on the wall? So it's always this sort of push and pull of impact of these small sculptures. And the large sculpture, well, depending on where you see that sculpture from, if you approach it, as you do outside the central train station, or even in the show upstairs where you walk down the corridor element, there's a renegotiation of your relative scale to that work. I did that, I think the first time I did that was in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in the UK. And I put this 9-foot piece into the rolling, manicured landscape of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which is incredible. And I was worried that the trees were going to make it look tiny. And in a sense they do, because you know how big a tree is, and you see it from a distance, and you walk up to this tiny little figure, this little silhouette, and it just gets bigger and bigger as you get to it. And then you're in its presence. Right. And the idea of like revealing the details through the enlargement is something I quite like. This way that the kind of the details embrace you. And then the experience of that work is augmented by the scale, because it's not a pathetic little thing. It's a powerful presence which has a vulnerability to it in the openness of the non-performative nature of standing, unlike a hero. There's a vulnerability in the realness of it, because we recognize ourselves in it. But the scale allows us to not feel sorry for it, because we're experiencing the power of that dynamic between ourselves and the object. And I think, there's push and pull in that. And the way that people walk around or want to step back from or get into, and lots of people want to touch. And then there's just the obvious understanding of it's big. So it's, important things are big, right? Like that's what we do in society. So like if you see something which is different to what you normally expect, particularly when connected to human beings, body type, posture, race, gender, when those are presented in a material that we understand to be powerful, at a scale that we understand to be powerful, it has a message and it has an impact.
What about the message behind the titles? They're poetic and they're often have a level of ambiguity to it.
Yeah, I love ambiguity. Again, well, I hate being spoon-fed understanding. You should think this. You should feel this. This is what this is. I like the works that are open because I want to bring myself to the work, and I want time to investigate my feelings about something, but also I don't know, it's fun. We're allowed to have fun when we look at work, and it's playful. And I think an element of fun and play is important when you're trying to bring people to new understandings, and particularly if you're trying to help people navigate terrain which is uncomfortable for them. If you allow them to engage in the fun process of putting together their references, then they find themselves at the end point for them at that moment in time, and they're like, and they've done it themselves. So for me, ambiguity is a delicious way to sort of infuse possibilities into something that could otherwise be seen as lecturing. Right. So, grounded in the stars, which we see here. I mean, it's a 12-foot tall sculpture of a person that I haven't seen out in public in this manner as a work, and I think it talks to the possibilities. The stars, the idea of being up there. I think it's a beautiful sort of title, which makes me think of poetry. But it talks about two things. This idea of being grounded. This idea of having to have a reality check every now and again, The idea of having to be stable and have a platform from which to be resilient. But the idea of always thinking about the potential, the limitless potential, possibly, This idea of like, even though you're on the ground, your head can be in the stars.
Right.
And it's that kind of dynamic, that paradox that I think, governs so many of our lives. I don't know, but I imagine everybody in this room has to be realistic, but you still have dreams. And I think this is what this is talking about.
Right. Do the titles also hint a little bit at your love for futurism, maybe? Because they're all, it's about movement, it's about... You don't want to expand.
You're going to leave me there.
Yeah. That was the...
Yeah. I think I'm a reasonably positive person, and I like to draw upon contrast, and I like to talk about mixed feelings about bus drivers. The works themselves are composites. I mix materials together. I use bronze, but I might coat it so that it looks like plastic. For me, it's more about celebrating the ambiguity and trying to draw people's awareness to the complexities of things. Everybody wants everything to be so simple. You want a simple line. And now that technology has created an immediacy, a need to be succinct. Like when Twitter first came out, everything had to be, I don't know how many characters. I remember being baffled by that. Like, how can you give an opinion or an answer or a question or a debate within so many characters? So we've now become accustomed to just giving a line or two, and then that's what we stand behind, and that's what we defend. But the complexities, the richness of life isn't that. And I feel like we've succumbed to pressures to pretend that it is. And so my works really celebrate the complexities and as I say, the potential of what experience can be, and what material can be, and what a message can be, and how a message can be conveyed, and how we carry messages with us every day, and how we can, when we come into contact with people, we exchange messages, we exchange attitudes, and I think we also need to take responsibility for the exchanges.
Right.
Instead of being like, well, how did I know? Or, I was just saying, there is a responsibility to communication. And as an artist, you have responsibility to the communication. And you take the consequences. And as an individual, you have responsibility in your communication, and you can be open to the consequences.
And I wonder, because I feel like Warm Shores is the sculpture that are two people, but most of the others are by themselves.
Yeah. I mean, so Warm Shores is a commission that was by Hackney Council to celebrate the Windrush descendants within Hackney, an area in East London. And I interviewed and took photographs of and scanned, I can't remember, like about 30 people or so who were connected to Windrush. And so it was a very different kind of premise to what I'd done before. It's a lot more specific. Right. I am descended from Windrush myself. So there was a personal kind of, I just talked about responsibility, didn't I? I felt responsible for a fullness of communication as to like what this work could be. Oh, there we go. And so I combined all these different people, but physically, as in from their scans, but also just in terms of the stories and the emotion that they were saying. And I wanted a work that celebrated what it meant to be there now.
Right.
And it wasn't like a period drama of like costume. It wasn't about travel. It wasn't about, being different. It was about, we are part of London. We are on the ground. They're very much on the ground with where we walk. And they're recognizable. And so for me, this idea of warm shores, there's a Windrush scandal, as it's called, the Windrush scandal in the UK, because many people who were connected to Windrush were then told, after living their whole lives in the UK, we don't have the paperwork for you. So you've been paying taxes, thank you, but you're going to have to leave the country. You have to go back to your home country. People weren't there since they were a baby, or and people were left in limbo when there was an appeal to this. So people couldn't work, you couldn't take benefits, so you had no access to money. You probably weren't allowed to stay in your council house if you had one, and you were told that you're basically you don't exist on paper, so you have no rights. And then there was a recognition from the government that, okay, we got it a bit wrong. As a baby, you should have probably given us the paperwork, but we got it wrong. So there was a call for compensation, and then the government agreed to compensation, but then they didn't pay it out. So people are still left in a position where they've been massively disadvantaged, well, not just because of the colonial history, because let's not forget, in 1948, the UK was calling for people from the Caribbean to come and rebuild the country after the war. So it's not just people came into the country, just they're going to live a better lives. There was an active drive to bring people in to help the UK, one more effort to help the UK to rebuild the country and become prosperous again. And so when people actually arrived in the country and they were told in all the advertisements, you're going to be welcomed, it's going to be amazing for you, they were actually told, you're not allowed to rent this house, you're not allowed to work this job. So there's a lot of bus driving jobs that were given to them. The existing bus drivers went on strike and said, you can't do this. So instead of this warm welcome, when they come into because I remember some of the people talking about how cold it was here, and they thought that it was, everything was on fire, but it was either the smog or the chimney smoke. So basically the expectation of warm welcome, prosperous life, and being integrated in society was actually met by a very cold shoulder, a cold welcome, and a barrier to being integrated or being part of society, because you couldn't even rent a house in certain areas. Right. So the reality was that. Exactly. It's a global thing.
Going maybe to the next. In the exhibition, you have this beautiful series called the Man series, and somebody made an observation saying, "Oh, nothing is happening here in these things." I don't have to point out who that was, but there's so much happening in the work. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you depict interiority and the movements of eyes, bodies in your animations?
Yeah, I'll try not to bore people with this. So with the Man series, they came after a performance piece I had done. And I was really interested in the way that people look and the way that people not manifest, but the interior spaces that we all have, our inner worlds, the things that we exist within and we look out from, and do we wonder about other people's? Or just are we contained within our own worlds? And so I used to watch people on buses, on the trains, and just think about, I just used to really be fascinated about what are they thinking. And so I had the idea to kind of use the sculptural language and use a material language to create tiny little puppets, basically, made out of plasticine, made out of wax. Plasticine here? Yeah. And they had painted beads for eyes, and these are literally about so big. And I set up a lighting rig around them. And I used stop-motion animation because my thinking was that I could really explore and analyze like a 3-minute moment of somebody's life with themselves and expand that time through the process of stop-motion animation. So I would go in and I timed blinks, eye movements to the frame. So there were like 24 frames a second. And I had different types of blinks, and the way that the eyes move are connected to the way that there is a theory that eye movement is connected to the psychological processes of the brain. So the way that we either recall memory, visual memories, audible memories, kinesthetic awareness, internal dialogue. So I used that as a guiding principle to create continuity throughout the animation series. And then I would compress that time again when I played it back at the frames per second. But there's also a play with scale, as we've talked about earlier. So this tiny little thing is then manipulated. So and you can see my finger marks and things happen as it's played back. And so when they're projected as these large animations. So there's a controlling of scale and there's a giving of time.
Right.
And that's the sort of the combination that creates this very simple looking work which emerges from the black. You're then confronted with the presence of somebody, almost like a landscape in terms of the way that the texture of the material, and they're quite rudimentarily done, so there's not like lifelike, uncanny valley, you know, kind of silicone doll, scary. It's that bit again where we, the viewer, are able to bring our humanity to the object, accept its movement, believe its mental presence, but then we're sort of snapped back out of it again when we go, oh, but actually there's something just moved on its face, or you can see that it's a plasticine head. So we're kept in this cycle of realization or perception. So that again, I'm trying to engage us in that process that we do on a daily basis.
And are they then in conversation with your paintings? Because that is also about like the movements of...
So yeah, the Inner Optics series of paintings, which has been ongoing for a few years, but not shown that much, again, goes right back to that thinking of the way the eyes move and the way that we look at something or the way that we avoid looking at something. And I like the idea of the negative space, the bit that's not got the paint on it, being perhaps a charged thing. So it's interesting that when I sort of stepped back from those works and really looked into what I was doing, because as an artist, you don't always want to be like, right, prescriptive, like, so I'm going to try and do work about how we think. And you do something because it feels right, because it engages you in a process of making, which is in keeping with, you know, your desire, basically. Yeah. And sometimes it's nice to step back and then see how it links so kind of succinctly to early ideas.
Gorgeous. We have one more question before we open it up for the floor. You can think of it right now. The request is always questions, not bios. Right? So I'm going to ask one more question. You can summarize in your mind what is it you would like to say. You ready? I see some people like looking like a little bit unsure. I wanted to end with a question. You have, there could be mobile phones, but it could also be something else, at least a portal of something that is reoccurring in most of your works. Yeah,
the idea of the mobile phone came from a desire to connect what looked like, or what could look like, a very kind of classical thing to a contemporary moment. So the idea of this very reduced thing, object, I like, because it makes us think about the way that we, again, connect to the world. And phones have become increasingly important. They are the portal through which we live our lives much of the time. I'm ashamed that I'm addicted to my telephone. If you take my phone, I haven't got my phone on me right now, and I'm like, you know, I'm patting myself down. It's a comfort. We get you know, indoctrinated into its use, and it gets connected to our emotions and the way that we experience each other as we become more and more isolated. You know, that's what's so good to see so many people here, but we are increasingly isolated. But I do like the ambiguous potential of a device and the way it's held or caressed, and the immediate understanding we have of that normalcy, the thing that we recognize that. Right. Now, the telephone might change, it might become something, but it will still be, I think, as a lot of classical sculptures have, something that we understand as a communication device and as a moment in somebody's life or daily, you know, day, where they are engaged in a kind of a mental and an emotional experience.
Because didn't it start out as a Nokia?
Yeah, there's one. In fact, he's here. One of the new series is holding something that's like almost like a walkie-talkie Nokia, and you know, you got to keep up with the times, guys. But the principle is the same. The intention is the same, and as I say, that's still understood. You know, so I like the fact that I'm not trying to make work which is permanent. I'm trying to make work which is understood in a way, or engaged with in a way which the meaning of it may evolve, but the kind of the reference points, I think, still hold water, you know. So this idea of the phone as a device which is connected to so many different understandings and experiences, but as a way of, well, initially as a way of snapping people out of the assumption that this is just another sculpture of a classical person, which never happened, actually, to be honest.
And as you're observant, so you look around, you see things. Is there something that you feel that is what I would like to fictionalize in my upcoming works?
That's a good question. That's a good. Do you know what really fascinates? The way that people stand, the way that I'm looking more towards the way that. So you mentioned Warm Shores, and it was the first time I did 2 people. It's the second time, to be honest. But I'm looking more at interaction. And I think the work has always been about engagement or lack of engagement. So this idea of groups and of connection. But you know, I'm not a trend spotter, so I don't know these things. But I'm fascinated in the poise, the gait, the way people walk, the way that we stand, the way that we stand away from, all these different. I'm just a geek, and I like looking at little details. So I imagine it'll just be a continuation of that process, or a continuation of delving into the details that reveal the depths of what we think and feel.
Gorgeous. So now up to you. Who has... We have 30 minutes.
We have 30 minutes.
30 minutes. You're not always here. Everybody's impressed with the work. Who says, listen, I would like to add something to this conversation? Somebody will come to you with a microphone. They will continue holding the microphone as you ask your question, just so you don't get tempted. Somebody stood up in green? That was you, yes.
Someone stand up?
Yes, Lynn. You saw me struggling with the bottle. You saw me struggling with the cup.
I didn't.
Sorry, I wanted to applaud first, but
there you
we can do that later, the applause.
Oh, just now. Thank you.
I'm a bit nervous for this question, but I am so curious.
Uh-oh.
I love your work.
But
I think it's beautiful.
Thank you.
What I would like to know, do you think you will ever make a sculpture, a statue of a white person?
Interesting question.
very interesting question.
Okay. That's a very good question.
You want some more?
Vodka?
You want something stronger?
No. So that's a very good question. So we've seen the first sculpture I did in 2004 of a person. And I was at college when I did that sculpture. I was in a very white college when I did that sculpture. And we'd have to show each other our works and have talks about works. And then at the end, there'll be questions, much like this, a slightly smaller group. And when it came to be my turn for questions, hands would go up. One person was chosen. And the question would be, why do you only sculpt black people? And then all the hands would go down, because that was the only question people had. Now, I say it's an interesting question because it's an example of the attitude that exists in terms of like our expectation for the world that we live in is that the de facto identity to be a human being is white. And even if we don't know that, that's the reality. And there are certain things that come along that make us aware of that. And some people feel uncomfortable about it. Or if you don't see yourself in the room, you're like, oh, God, you know. But can you imagine what it's like to go into spaces and never see yourself in the room? It's a very interesting experience. And as soon as something changes your understanding of what might be normal, I can understand it can be a very interesting experience. My mother is white, and I have great conversations with her about this. So would I ever sculpt a white person? Quite possibly, yes. I mean, the truth is I already have. So my first animations were of white people. And then I sculpted a black person, because I was doing work about people I had observed. And when I did the first animation of a black person, the comments changed from, oh, he reminds me of my father, or I wonder what he's thinking, or he must be feeling this, to, oh, he's black. Why is he black? And I remember being in that space, surrounded by white people, looking at this black character, asking me why I, a black man, had sculpted a black person, and I didn't know what to say. So I think, and I'm glad it does take courage to ask a question, so I appreciate that, thank you. And I'll use it as a way to highlight the expectations that my work places itself against. And the reason I continue to sculpt black people is because why not? Why not? So I remember saying when again, in 2000, and I can date this, 2004, I spoke to a tutor at the Royal College, at Chelsea College of Art. And he was trying to prepare me for interviews to the Royal College. And he phrased that question to me. And I said, well, how many times does Lucian Freud get asked why he only paints white people? And if you look at the content of those questions, if you look at the context of those questions, it has to acknowledge the expectation that human beings, the human experience, exists through a white lens. And everything else is diverse, is an ethnic minority. But where? So I appreciate the question because it allows me to say publicly and quite explicitly that living with that expectation, if you are not that, is an incredibly stressful thing to do. And I feel like we're only really re-engaging again with the languages around, I'm thinking back to how many books are there out there? How many recordings are there of people who have discussed this topic?
Quite a few.
And we're still here where we live our lives with the expectation that human beings, thinking, feeling human beings, not groups that are talked about, not groups that drown in the crossings, between the UK and France. Not people that experience earthquakes, not people human beings that think and feel and get to live and dream are white. And everything else is a version of that. And as I've tried to talk about today, my works are trying to communicate a feeling and understanding and a plea almost that we are all human beings who think, feel, and dream. And so, do you think we need another statue of a white person at the moment? Would be my question.
And maybe just to add, I know the question wasn't directed at me, but maybe just to add, because we talked about references a lot, you have this beautiful clip of Toni Morrison, who gets asked the same question, when are you going to write about white people? And she has a beautiful response, but also acknowledging how incredibly racist the question is, right? Because it comes from a position of wanting to be in the center and being very much used to being in the center. And then also consider, what it takes for, and I do want to point that out. In this case it was Toni Morrison, but in this case it's you, and I feel like you were such a brilliant thinker, and you gave us so much during the conversation. You talked about skill, you talked about material, you talked about all these references. So I hope the next questions can really also engage with the work that you do, and the mind that you have, and the wit that you have showed us.
Well, like I say, I make work about the experience of being human.
Right.
And my work was racialized when I was a very young man, first showing that work. And it's the reality, Like I say, as an artist, you take responsibility for your communication, you accept the consequences. And I think we do live in a very racist world, that's just the reality of it. But, so the question is formed from that environment, but I think, as I say, I thank you for the question, because it's given us an opportunity.
Yes, thank you.
Right.
I was wondering, how would you sculpt humanity if you couldn't sculpt human beings? Because, a lot of your work is people.
Thank you. That's a great question, Keith. I feel I have to mime the answer. How would I sculpt humanity if I couldn't sculpt people? Well, I guess in a way I've been trying to. So there's a sculpture in the show called Sonic Work Collective Palette No. 1, which is actually the casting of the inside of my ear. And so that is really looking at trying to make the invisible visible, but it's also sort of talking to the kind of the conduit between the outside world and our inner selves, our inner thoughts, and sort of the sayings of like, lend me your ear, the idea of listening, the idea of being heard, and I think it's important to listen, as we listened to the question earlier. And the idea of getting to somebody's head. So in a sense, I have been. We could look also into the work called Licked, which I did as a very young man, where I licked the inside of this room for 3 days. That was very much about trying to create a sense or an understanding of connection to another. Like, would people sense the presence of the person who had been and done this work, this labor? So the work was also about that labor, about that endeavor to connect, that endeavor to engage, the sacrifice to try to communicate one's existence to a society. The paintings, about the very process of looking, the very process of perhaps seeing or not seeing, the rhythm, the movement, and the color is a way to connect our awareness to that inner process. So I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that I've been trying to answer, because it is a nice sort of complement and counter to the figurative works which have been so interesting to work with.
A few questions here in the front, but maybe also...
Okay, I want to ask you, are you working on yourself, or are you working...
I'm always working on myself.
Yeah, you're not working in a team? Or giving
Oh, do I work by
ideas?
myself?
Because you have so much sculptures. I'm sculpturing for myself as an amateur.
Yeah.
But it's so much work.
It is.
So I was thinking,
Yeah.
all those sculptures are your own?
I work entirely by myself. Everything I do is my own genius. No, I don't. I embrace the studio principle. I mean, every artist from painter to sculptor who does anything that's remotely ambitious has to work with amazing people. And I have some of them here with me today. So, I get to take the praise though, so what are you doing? So the idea of, working with people to try to hold on to your idea, to hold on to the vision, to hold on to the thing that engaged you in the process in the first place. Because, when I was a student or was just starting out, I would get to sit. The luxury of sitting in a studio and just doing your thing and just being, connected to the process and to the material. It shifts slightly when you want to do a 12-foot sculpture, for example. I can't do that by myself, so I have to be able to engage in a slightly different way, but maintain that continuity of ideas and intention to work with a team of people who, again, are very talented people, to create the same impact, the same effect, with the same style, in a way that acknowledges the realities of physicality of the work. So, as much as I like my own space, my own time, I'm also very grateful to be able to have the opportunity to work with amazing people who sometimes bring in different understandings, their expertise, their experience of working with materials. The different types of bronze I work with. You haven't got really geeky with this, but there's various different alloys I work with. There are different methods of gilding. There's different kind of casting applications and methodologies. So I think it's really important to work with as many people, to listen to people, to kind of inform one's practice, and to try to create the richest end result as possible. So I work with more and more people, if I'm honest, and hopefully the end result maintains that sort of interest for the viewer.
There's one here in the front also.
Hi. Oh, yeah. Hi. So I got a question about how do you say it? The ages. Like if you look at the child there, you ever think about making something like that it's a child, or maybe someone really old, or maybe a baby? I don't know. Are you thinking about that?
Good question. Short answer is yes, but the interesting answer is a bit longer. So yes, for me, so what you might notice is I never work at one-to-one scale. I never work at true scale. So they're often like 1.5 times or much reduced. And there's an interesting thing that happens if you sculpt somebody who's supposed to be small at 1.5 times, they become like human size, and there's a weird sort of reality check when you place an object into a real space. It can feel a bit awkward. So I've sort of resisted that challenge so far, but I am developing works which do take that on. But it's also about acknowledging, so I often get asked about the ages of my characters, right? And I feel there's just, there's something understood to the already lived experiences of somebody who seems to be older, who appears to be older, compared to the understanding of somebody, if we talk about a continuum perhaps, and somebody who perhaps has it all ahead of them. And we feel differently about those psychological propositions. And that's why often the age is a little bit ambiguous, but they're often like like maybe on the cusp of something. So like, for example, like moments contained. I couldn't tell you how old she is, but I think we get a sense of there's life yet to be lived there, and there's challenges yet to come. And so with a child, it's normally stuff that's projected on. It's normally about the protective instinct of the individual around them. So there's different psychological connections to these presented ages. And you know, even though I work in a team, it takes me a long time to make these things. So I sort of work my way through the ideas, and then I get really involved in the particular thing I've just done, and so you get into the nuances, and you get to delve deeper, and you go down the rabbit hole. So the ages are normally decided upon to try to connect an audience to a very particular way of feeling about that proposed character. And, well, let's just see what happens. A good question.
Maybe let's move also a little bit to there's somebody here in jeans and somebody on the side. I think you are row 5, yes? And then somebody behind that person.
Thank you for your work. I really appreciate. As you can see, I'm black. So I'm really happy for the representation that I don't have, because I love art, and yeah, thank you for that. My question is 1 and 2. I was thinking, how long is the process to make a sculpture? How long does it take? And does the news, I was thinking, for example, George Floyd or whatever is happening in the world, help you make the sculpture?
Very good question. So in terms of the duration of the making process, I mean, you can kind of split the making process into various different kind of things. So there's the inception. There's the trying to think of the thing. Like, what am I going to make? Who am I going to make? If we decide it's already going to be a figure, okay, so that's already editing down the process. So it's who it is. And that process can take varying degrees of time depending on what I hit. You know, like sometimes you just know I'm there and I'm doing it and it's it. Sometimes it's not it. And you have to just allow yourself time to get to that point where it feels right. I have work that is ongoing, that exists as a digital file that has been over a year. So that can be a short or a long period of time process. Then we have the actual fabrication itself. So let's just say the work's going to be in bronze, right? So that process itself, depending on the scale, even the smaller ones, they can take 6 months. They can take longer. If it's about developing the alloy so that it gives the correct or the desired impact, it took me 2 years to find the right alloy for a particular piece. So that the duration of, or the distance between thinking of the thing or having the inspiration to do a thing and then the realization of the thing can be very far apart. And so that connects very well to what you're saying in terms of the items in the news and the things that you know, the horrendous things that keep happening, or sometimes the good things that happen. The world has been the way it is for so long that within this, these horrible things happen, but the context is the same for me. In terms of the hooded top, you know, we haven't talked that much about it, but I did make a reference to Trayvon Martin, who was murdered, with the hooded top. And I showed a work in 2019 in Toronto called Cover Up the Reveal. It's a guy that, for me, was based actually on religious sculpture, like a monk almost, and the hood's up or down. And it's a very much a direct reference to this item of clothing, which has very different implications depending on who you are wearing it, in a way that referenced formalized, classical, and well-understood sculpture. And the title, Cover Up, parenthesis, The Reveal, is about the fact that it was all covered up. and it continually is. It's not the first time that's happened. It happens in different countries. Seemingly, they're always the same people. So what is the common denominator in this? And it's easy to see, right? So it doesn't make it easier, but sometimes it makes me feel, well, it just makes me feel sad, in all honesty. But it does make me feel glad that I continue to do the work despite these other things happening. But what I'm being a little bit cagey because I don't want to say, I'm doing this. I make my work about being human and my experiences of being human as well. And I am aware of the news and I'm impacted of the news just like everybody else. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, I'm impacted by the news and what's happening every day in the news. And what it means to be human, or told you're not human, or told you're barbarian, or told that you're civilization. These things are still happening on various different scales, macro and all sorts of scales that we are pushed towards understandings that you're taught. Was it Orson Welles? You're supposed to love the boot that crushes your neck, kind of thing, And I don't want to love the boot that's trying to crush my neck. And my work is about trying to be in the stars.
We have one more question over here. Somebody, and then we move up. And I feel like there's some questions in the back also. Okay. Oh, somebody's waving. Okay, that's dope.
Hello. I have a little bit funny question, maybe a trivial question. The statue there before Central Station, she wears sneakers from the brand Nike. Why did you choose for Nike and not, for instance, Adidas or Puma? Is there a choice behind it, or is just...
Yeah. Again, it's an acknowledgement of familiarity, and it's a way to connect people to the reality of their lives. So there are certain types of clothing and brands which carry an immediate recognition and a familiarity which says, that's me, or I recognize that, or that's real. I can assure you I'm not paid by Nike. But I haven't received a cease and desist letter from Nike also. So for me, it's about presenting a reality of certain things. Not all the trainers are, but there's certain styles. Like if I said black Air Force Ones, some people would understand the context of those trainers, right? And what that means. If I talk about Air Maxes, people know what it means. I have no love or hate for Nike, but I do use real-world references to convey a believability in a format. You said statue, I called it sculpture. Sculpture about statue. No, I'm just saying it's about that investigation of icons, of established format, and presentation in a world that is about consumption, and you can delve into the production of these items and the labor that brands use. But this is really about connecting people in a shorthand way to a recognized life that they either live themselves or they recognize in others.
Two here, and then the person was... Wave again? The person was waving? No, everybody's waving. That's not fair. Okay, we see a few wavers, yes. Somebody here with a pink bow in their hair. That looks nice.
Right?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My name is Lisandra, and I love the series of the little sculptures with the naked men, because I found it very funny how you've hidden some gems. So I was really, from one sculpture I was looking like, okay, where does it fit in? But I found it. Yeah. While I was looking through these sculptures, I overheard a conversation about the misrepresentation of the manly...
As my niece said, willies.
Yes. Yes. Do you get a lot of remarks of the black community about how they want you to sculpture them, or how they find that something is not right according to their opinion.
Their own experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, first off, I'd probably tell them to stop showing off. But so when I made those works in 2008, that series, and I wasn't aware of the work of Barclay L. Hendricks at the time. And I was trying to make works which were a nod to Greek sculpture with an awareness of the Roman individuality of portrayal, which used real-world people and non-idealized. So I said non-ethnographic kind of like, or kind of specimen type. You know, it was about, I felt there was a real power in being able to have a belly or slump or just be yourself and still be valued and still be human. And present them at a scale that was kind of small, so you would really get close to them. And to give them titles of these street names that sounded a little bit sort of heroic, perhaps, to play a game of contrast. And I showed them in Chicago, at an art fair in Chicago. Unfortunately, just as the economic slump happened. But I remember being absolutely fascinated by the response in the US from all sorts of people. And one guy came up to me, I was there, one guy came up to me, and he was like, if only they just had like, even just guns in front of their penises, it would be better. You know, it's just, how have you got they're just naked. Like, the vulnerability that this guy felt, and that was a white guy, the vulnerability that guy felt was huge. Perhaps unlike the members. But I can't believe I got into a discussion about size on here. But
Scale. We talked about scale.
Talk about scale, there we go. The whole idea of, you know, the kind of fetishization of what people are supposed to look like, the fetishization of what a black man is supposed to be, you know, this machismo attached to it. There's a sculpture upstairs called Power Object, section 1, number 1. It's a cross-section of a groin of a sculpture, or a statue. Some black men in 2008 in Chicago at the art fair were angry because they felt these were too vulnerable. But my take on it is that there is power in vulnerability. If you constantly have to project an image of power, and let's look at our politicians right now. If you constantly have to project an image of power and maintain that because your real sense of self, of worth, of value is actually so low, you're going to impact everybody around you in a negative way. So for me, this was like a challenge to other black men about showing real value, real confidence, and pushing into that uncomfortableness that frees you from the expectation and frees you from the limiting perceptions, the limiting tropes of what it means to be black. How's somebody going to tell me what it means to be black? You live your life, and you know, you try and live it true to yourself, and that's what those works are trying to talk about. I think that's a great question.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left. Wait, there were people like waving near the. See, somebody stood up now. Okay, let's go there. Anybody else in the back once they're up there? Okay, 2. And then do you, and then, so basically 4. But short, so we can keep it in the time. Because I'm getting nods, yes.
So first off, as a Rotterdam born and raised woman, I really enjoy your work in our city. There's something about the way you portray masculinity and femininity in your work, and I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that. There's a softness, a little bit of a rawness. Could you, yeah?
Ooh,
could you, something?
Okay. I'm really trying to think about this one. Because it's interesting because when I presented the first large female character, I did so after a lot of hesitation, after many years of resisting it, because I was worried about being another male sculptor sculpting a woman. And if you look at the history of how that has gone, it's led to very particular representations. And so this idea of masculinity and femininity, or how there's a rawness or perhaps a believability to it, is because I realized that I was sculpting individuals. I was sculpting feelings. I always talk about sculpting over an emotional armature. And so I just applied the emotional armature to whoever I'm sculpting. What are they feeling? What are their dreams? What are their hopes? What are their fears? How do I see this person? How do we connect or not connect? And then, the construct, the physical construct is built around that. And it intuitively gives a posture and a poise and an expression that, through ambiguity or the inclusion of some ambiguity, it's not telling you what to think. So you're interpreting it in a way that feels authentic and real because you're bringing your authentic, real thoughts and feelings to it. So I think if that is the case in terms of the effectiveness of it, it's because I leave enough open to, like the eyes, for example, which are scooped out. It's because we fill that last detail. I'm not drawing the pupils on for you to tell you that's where they're looking, or this is how they're feeling, or this is the dilation. You get to feel the expression of your emotions and your interpretation in that moment of connection. So, yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to work it out. I don't know.
Okay. There's somebody in front of the television over there, and then somebody here with a black shirt on, I believe. And then somebody here in the front with a yellow suit. But you can maybe start, there's somebody in front of the television. Yes.
Good morning. Can you reflect on your personal connection with Rotterdam since your beautiful art is here?
Aww.
That's a great, so my family came, as in my mother and my brother and my niece and his partner. And Rotterdam's like their favorite city now. It was before they came, honestly. So we were walking around yesterday and just, obviously there's lots of sculptures, but I think there's a realness and a complexity to the city, and in relation to the scale also. So you get to kind of walk across a lot of it and experience a lot of it outside of a car, perhaps. That seems to be really rewarding. My own personal take, obviously it's in relation with the work. It's in visiting before the work was installed to even talk about its, placement. To walk in front of the Central's train station and come up with a convincing argument as to why it should go there. To learn about, the reaction to the work, good and bad, and to hear that some people were told this is not Rotterdam when I see people who look like her walking past the statue. It's kind of crazy. So, my reflections on and experience of Rotterdam has been very positive overall. And that's why it's so good to come back here and do the show. And I don't know, I've got lots of good things to say about Rotterdam. I think a city that is able to challenge itself and challenge the perceptions of its citizens and have a global impact through its courageousness should be applauded. You can applaud yourselves. And I don't know, there's a richness here, and a diversity in terms of there's a nice dynamic that I enjoy. I'm from London, so I'm used to big cities, I'm used to lots of diversity. But it's massive, and you don't get to necessarily get the concentration of experience. So I've been really sort of, I don't want to say proud, I don't want to sound like a patronizing bastard, but I'm so impressed by the seeming risk that was taken. I feel silly saying that, but the risk that was taken and the reward that I see through that willingness to engage with critical thinking and to expand the understandings and the acceptance of what it means to be part of Rotterdam. So I think I'm very impressed, and I hope that other places look to Rotterdam as a way of thinking and breathing into difficult conversations.
Great. Okay, the last two. The person who has her hand up with the shirt and then.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. I have a short question. You touched upon it. The coatings. Why do you use the coatings to make it look more plastic?
Coatings. So the finishes on some of the bronze, particularly the black bronze, is because, so as we saw with my first sculpture, it was plaster with marble dust in it, so I was already trying to explore and investigate and critique this understanding of materiality. So what are the values carried by material? What are the expectations of material? And with bronze, when I first started to use bronze, I wasn't comfortable with bronze. This was the power of, this was the material of power. This is the statues in the cities I went to, or lived in, you know, were bronze figures. You know, the crushing attitudes, the monuments that celebrate victories and all the sort of things that actually carry a lot of negative sort of legacy were in bronze. So I wanted to play with the idea of what if they look like plastic? What if they look like the plastic of a mobile phone, or the plastic of, you know, something ready-made, or I'm just feeling this, something that we felt more familiar, more akin to contemporary world. Would that create a moment of sudden recognition when somebody learns that it's bronze? Right. So how much can you disguise bronze before the power of it is removed? And it turns out you can disguise it a lot and it still has the power. So I use bronze now with much more ease, and I like the black because I like playing with silhouette, so a lot of my works are made using silhouette as a way to sculpt them. But the coatings are still that little nod to the genesis of my inclusion of that material, the acknowledgement of the value associated with bronze, the desire to disrupt people's understandings of value, and just on a purely practical level, bronze is an amazing material which lends itself to casting objects in great detail, which can be durable for many, many years. So it has that, but that also carries a conceptual element to it because it has a sense of permanence. And if something's going to be permanent, it's normally because it's supposed to be good and valuable.
Last question here. No pressure. Oh, wait, there's a mic coming to you.
Who is she for you?
Ooh. Who is she to me? That's a great question, because obviously I made it, so I can't say, I don't know. I will say that for me, she is many things. She is the reaction that people have when she's placed in a location. She is a moment of honesty in that part of your mind which isn't being guarded when you give an identity to her. So she's, for me, as the artist who made that work, she is an opportunity to express my desire for people to open up themselves to an honesty and a broadened perception of what she can be. When I look at her, she's many different people. I honestly don't have she doesn't have a name for me. As I said, I really don't know her age. But there is a resilience and a self-contained self-worth. So maybe she's confidence to me. Maybe she's a call to confidence and a call to challenge and an acknowledgement of resistance and resilience, which we can all sort of celebrate and see in each other and take strength from and help to move each other in the right direction. I hope she's an opportunity for people to see themselves and feel valued. She's so many things. And depending on where she goes, I'm sure she'd turn into other things. So in Rotterdam, she's all of those things, and I'm sure more.